Oh boy, man, do I love doing episodes like this one because this is exactly why I got into podcasting, was to have conversations like the one I had with Dr. Philip Avadia. This is the second time he's come on the podcast, and we wanted to just zero in on the topic of cholesterol and what it means for you, what it means for your health, and what we got all wrong about this tiny little molecule. Stay tuned for an awesome episode. Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of the Hard to Kill podcast. Again with Dr. Philip Avadia. Welcome. Much
Great to be.
appreciated to be here. Actually, this is the third time we're doing a re-record, folks, because we did an episode that was I think that was in January or somewhere around there. And the podcast became a casualty of war, believe it or not. I couldn't log into my server because they were housed in Ukraine, and I didn't get access in time for me to get a file, which happened to be this podcast. So Philip has graciously said, sure, I'll come back on and we'll record this again. So much appreciated. Thanks for coming back on. And today we're chatting all about cholesterol, because this is a major topic that I have conversations with my clients on, but it's a significantly, I guess, better decision on my part, or on the podcast part, to have an expert like yourself explain what is cholesterol and why we have this like distorted perspective of like what cholesterol is, and how we can use it to our advantage when getting healthy. So Doc, why don't you give the listeners your background, because this might be the first time that individuals are tuning into to you and haven't listened to the other episode.
Sure thing, Dave, and it's great to be back here with you. Obviously, cholesterol is a hot topic and a little bit controversial, maybe, and kind of scary to think that they may have started a war just to keep this conversation from getting out there. But we won't let them keep us down, right?
Oh
So,
man, imagine.
For those of you who didn't catch me the first time with Dave, my name is Philip Ovadia. I'm a heart surgeon, a cardiac surgeon. Been in practice now for 20 years. And over the past 5 years or so, I have been on my own journey to improve my health. I was pre-diabetic, I was morbidly obese, and I figured out how to fix that for myself. And along the way, I figured out what really is at the root cause of heart disease, the disease that I treat every day, and the disease that remains the number one killer in the United States and worldwide. And I am now on a mission to help people to learn how to stay off of my operating table, how to prevent heart disease. And, I have come to learn, and I've come to strongly believe that heart disease is largely preventable, and we really should not have the high demand for my services as a heart surgeon that we currently do. And of course, cholesterol is at the forefront of that. So let's get into it.
Cool. I love the fact that you're trying to teach people enough that you will be obsolete. That's the sign of somebody that's truly committed, right, to their cause. Like, get off my operating table, like get out of here. Like, I don't want to treat you. Well, no, not treat you, but I don't want to see you here because I want you to get healthier. That's really noble, and I love that message. And so, yeah, let's tackle right away. What is cholesterol? What's the molecule? What is it? So that people that have no clue, that didn't take any, let's say, university level science, so they can get a better understanding at a granular level. Like, what is this thing? Like, why are we so scared of it?
Yeah, so the first thing to understand is that cholesterol is essential to human life, and it plays a number of roles in the body. Probably the two most important roles that it plays is it literally, makes up the wall of all the cells within our body. It makes up what we call the cell membrane. And the other essential role for cholesterol in the body is that it is the precursor, it is the building block for many of the hormones in our body, many of the essential hormones, including the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen primarily, as well as cortisol, another very important hormone for our body. So cholesterol plays a very important role in our bodies. Our bodies manufacture it. And, if we are not able to manufacture cholesterol, we literally cannot live. So, those are a couple of basic things to understand. Now, where the other, thing to understand is that cholesterol is in many of the foods that we eat. And, especially when you look at animal products, like humans, all these animals, cholesterol is essential to their existence as well. So cholesterol is in, the animal products that we're eating. There are also plant forms of cholesterol. So many, plant products have cholesterol in them. And the relationship between the cholesterol that we eat and the amount of cholesterol in our body has been, I'll say, misunderstood. And it turns out that there probably is not a very significant relationship between the amount of cholesterol that we eat and the amount of cholesterol that ends up in our bloodstream. And
Hmm.
when most people talk about their cholesterol levels when they go and get their blood tests done to check their cholesterol levels, you're looking at the amount of cholesterol that is in their bloodstream at that moment in time. And again, what relationship that has to all of the cholesterol in their body is another thing that is oftentimes misunderstood.
Okay.
So, those are some of the basics about what cholesterol is, why it exists, why we have it in our bodies, and the relationship between the cholesterol that we eat and the cholesterol, that we measure in our bloodstream. And then as we, get deeper into this conversation, we'll then talk about what implications the cholesterol in our bloodstream may have for our overall health.
Okay, great. So let me just, I guess, dumb this down for myself as much as possible. So I eat, let's say, a steak. There's cholesterol in red meat.
Yep.
That, gets digested, it gets broken down into its component parts, its macronutrients, all its micronutrients, and then the cholesterol. Okay, now where does that go? Does that automatically end up getting processed and like stored in your liver, or does it get broke down into little globules and then sent all over the place? What happens there? And does that like immediately raise your cholesterol level?
No, it doesn't. So it turns out that, a lot of the cholesterol that we eat, and again, this can come from plant products or it can come from animal products, but a lot of the cholesterol that we eat actually doesn't even get absorbed by the body. It basically just passes through and, doesn't get absorbed. But even, the amount that gets absorbed is actually very small compared to the amount of cholesterol that is in our bodies. And again, the amount that's in our bloodstream and the amount that's in all of the cells of our body, of our bodies. So it turns out, that there is very little relationship between the amount of cholesterol that you eat and the amount of cholesterol that is in your bloodstream. The
Wow.
amount of
Okay.
cholesterol that is in your bloodstream is mostly related to how much cholesterol your body is making, and then how that cholesterol is then getting recycled, because there's a whole cycle that cholesterol, gets made in the liver, it gets sent out all throughout your body in different, kind of gets carried in different particles that we'll talk about. Some of it gets stored in different places, and then it gets broken down again and recycled by the liver. And depending on all of the sort of parts of that process, that is then going to determine how much cholesterol is in your bloodstream, and then gets measured on a blood test.
Gotcha. Okay, so then the big distinction for the listener out there, when you consume like let's say fat, let's say it's even saturated fat from meat, that is different from the cholesterol that's in the meat, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So cholesterol, dietary cholesterol we're talking about, and dietary saturated fat are actually two separate things. They tend to, I guess, go together in some ways. So foods that are higher in saturated fat also tend to be higher in dietary cholesterol, and that is, why there has been this association, ultimately between, that has been made, although again
Hmm.
without great scientific, foundation, between dietary saturated fat, blood cholesterol levels, and then ultimately, heart disease outcomes.
Okay, so let's get into it. That's a really important concept, right? This idea that eating fat will either A, get you fat, but B, more importantly, it's going to give you coronary heart disease. So let's get into that. What makes you say that the link isn't really there and we've been kind of, I guess I don't know if the word is duped or just misled to believe that eating too much saturated fat would lead to coronary heart disease.
Right. So, when we step back to, let's say the 1940s, 1950s, scientists were trying to figure out, the cause of heart disease. Heart disease was increasing in, prevalence and becoming a more of a health issue. Realized that coronary heart disease was, very rare, and basically undescribed in the early 1900s. And then throughout the early 1900s, we see it start to rise. And the 1940s, 1950s, it starts to reach, serious, epidemic type levels. And so scientists were trying to figure out what was causing it. And there were two main theories. One was that it was sugar, and the sugar that we were eating, and the other was that it was related to the fat that we were eating, specifically saturated fat. And the diet heart hypothesis, which is what it was called at the time, that the amount of saturated fat that we were eating would raise our blood cholesterol levels, and that raised blood cholesterol level then increased the risk of heart disease, was really pushed forward by a scientist by the name of Ansel Keys in the 1950s in the United States. And Ansel Keys became very heavily involved with the American Heart Association, and he also got involved with the personal physician of President Eisenhower, who had a
Ooh.
heart attack while in office. And Ansel Keys sort of got consulted as
Mm.
how best to deal with this. And again, he kind of pushed forward his theory that was unproven at the time, that saturated fat caused the amount of saturated fat that you ate, ended up leading to a raised incidence of heart disease. And there were a number of things that went on sort of politically, but this became the prevalent belief after the 1950s, that the amount of saturated fat that you ate had a direct relationship in raising your blood cholesterol level, and that raised blood cholesterol level then increased your risk of heart disease.
Mm.
And it turns out that there are reasons to doubt both parts of that diet heart hypothesis. And when you look at the scientific studies on the amount of saturated fat that we eat and its relation to blood cholesterol levels, the findings are inconsistent. Yes, there are some studies that show, a relationship there, but there are other studies that show that there's no relationship on, both a population level and sort of an individual level.
Right. Well, the first time I heard about that was in Gary Taub's book. I can't remember which one. It was a while ago. I was in university when I read it, and it kind of broke my paradigm, right? Because I was like, wait, hold on a sec, what are you saying? What's this diet heart hypothesis? Like, is this what we're all using to base our nutrition guidelines on, and it's not right? Because I grew up reading Men's Health, and I
Yep.
thought I was like an elite kind of nutrition guy, right? Like, oh, I know how to eat. Like, I follow the food pyramid. I eat enough grains. I eat enough, and I keep my fat really low. And then I read his book, and it made me kind of upset because I was like, wait, hold on a second, is this based on a lie? And it forced me down this path. And it's kind of part of the reason why I'm here now because it made me really curious. Let's just put it that way.
Yep.
And it was interesting to hear. The thing that stuck out to me was that during his study, Ansel Keys' study, he just conveniently left out some really, I guess, some data that would contradict his own hypothesis. So he just said, "Yeah, we're going to leave that out," like the Mediterranean type diets, and I think it was the Okinawans as well, that ate a substantial amount of fat, but didn't see the correlation. So why is it then that the cholesterol molecule got blamed for all the coronary heart disease and not lifestyle or anything else? What was it about cholesterol that made it such an evil molecule?
Yeah, so that probably goes back to when we look at the plaques that build up in the arteries, and this happens throughout the body, but it becomes most problematic in the heart when these plaques start to obstruct and block these arteries. Um, there is cholesterol in those plaques. And so, it was a logical conclusion then that, the more cholesterol you have in your bloodstream, the more of these plaques that are going to, build up. But the reality is that the cholesterol is a repair mechanism that the body uses when
Hmm.
the blood vessel walls get damaged. And these can be damaged by things like inflammation, smoking, high amounts of sugar in your blood will damage the blood vessel walls, and it basically ends up, the analogy that I like to use, and this is borrowed from many people, is that it's like blaming the firemen for starting the fire because every time there's a fire, there were firemen then there. And so,
It's a logical inference, right?
yeah, if you didn't know what was going on, you would say, okay, the
They're
firemen
always
must be
there.
starting all these fires because they're always there. And, in the same way that is kind of, I think, at the root of how cholesterol ended up getting blamed for, causing heart disease.
Hmm.
What I like to do is step back and say, okay, but what caused the blood vessel damage in the first place? And these are the things that we should be focusing on if we really want to prevent heart disease. Because trying to lower the cholesterol while still having the damage being done to your blood vessels, ultimately is not going to be a successful strategy. Unless you
Right.
could somehow lower the cholesterol level to zero, which we know we can't do.
Hmm.
So I would rather people focus on, the factors that are causing the damage to the blood vessels, rather than just trying to, prevent lower the cholesterol, thinking that that's going to prevent this buildup.
Hmm. So therefore, just to go over what you just said there, what can damage the art? It's the I guess it's the coronary arteries, right? I
Well,
s-
yeah,
it's stress. So stress, I guess, like that is chronic, I imagine. Like if you're, living a hard life, you got a crappy job, you're constantly stressed out, which would increase, I guess, cortisol levels. So does that imply that is cortisol the main driver of that, or is it multifactorial? Like it's one of the reasons that causes some of the issues.
yeah, stress ends up probably being multifactorial. Stress tends to raise your blood pressure. We know that high blood pressure is one of the biggest risk factors for heart disease.
Mhm.
As I said, increased sugar levels, we know directly damage the blood vessels,
So
and
that
so
means like increased sugar levels, like we're talking like just carbohydrates in general. Like if you're, that doesn't matter if you're eating like refined or high fructose corn syrup, just if you have a high carb diet, that can is correlated to coronary heart disease.
yes, having, and again, this gets into the whole issue of metabolic health and diabetes and hyperinsulinemia, all of these things. And it's tough to show which one
Right.
of those particular factors, because they all tend to go together, ends up causing it. But, there have been some, kind of, foundational experiments done that show that, sugar is directly damaging to the blood vessel wall. So the
Wow.
more sugar you have in your bloodstream, over an extended period of time, the more damage you're going to end up to your blood vessel wall.
Wow.
Smoking, we know, many of the toxins that are in cigarettes are again directly damaging to the blood vessel wall. And obviously we know that smoking is one of the biggest risk factors for heart disease.
Yeah.
Um, which kind of leads us to the studies that look at what are the risk factors for heart disease. And what we consistently find in those studies is that, having a raised cholesterol level, specifically a raised LDL cholesterol level, the so-called bad cholesterol, increases your risk of heart disease, somewhere, let's say 1.4 to 1.6x, the baseline level. But when you look at things like insulin resistance or poor metabolic health or type 2 diabetes, all measures of sort of the same thing, we see that those raise your risk of heart disease between 4 and 7 times. So it's a much bigger risk factor than the raised LDL cholesterol level.
Whoa.
Smoking is along, that same magnitude effect as well, of 5 to 7 times the risk of developing heart disease. So it's not that cholesterol doesn't play any role in the process. It's just that cholesterol is not the most important factor. It's not at the root cause of what ultimately leads to heart disease. And that's why I, now advocate that we look at those root causes and we not be so focused on cholesterol and cholesterol only
Mhm.
as a preventative measure for heart disease.
That's a great point. And maybe this is a weird question, but I mean, with the fellows that I work with, this is something that I recognize, and I know there's a trend too of to falling testosterone levels.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't consume enough cholesterol, would that negatively affect your ability to synthesize testosterone, or would your body be able to just create it just naturally anyways, and it wouldn't have a big effect? But do you know if that would be a contributing factor to low testosterone, not actually
Well,
eating enough?
yeah, it's hard just by not eating enough to get your cholesterol level that low that it would be a problem. But
Right.
it does become a concern, when we have people on medications to be lowering their cholesterol level to, very low levels, that is going to then have an impact on, being able to make these essential hormones like the sex hormones. Um,
Okay.
the more common problem that I guess I see is that people with poor metabolic health overall tend to have low testosterone levels because, again, metabolic health is referring to your body's ability to be doing all of the, kind of cellular level, metabolic processes that we need to be doing. One of them is, making hormones like testosterone. And so what I commonly encounter is, men with low testosterone levels. My first thought is, let's look at your metabolic health. Let's improve your metabolic health and see if that if that ends up improving your testosterone levels.
Mm.
The other sort of, I guess, indirect problem that I see, on these, low fat diets, specifically, I'll point out the vegan diet, but it's not necessarily restricted to vegans, is that, if you're not eating if you're avoiding animal proteins essentially because you're worried about the saturated fat and you're not getting adequate protein levels, you're going to have low levels of muscle mass, and that is something else that contributes to your testosterone levels. We know that men that have low levels of muscle also have low testosterone levels. So those are probably the two biggest problems I see around testosterone and just metabolic health and muscle mass in general. And they sort of end up being indirectly related to the amount of cholesterol that you're eating, but it's not really that direct relationship.
Right, right. Like everything, it's always multifactorial, right? Like
Yeah,
you have one issue, but that is usually related to another issue that you're not addressing. So if we just look at this like big picture, if you have a poor diet, meaning you eat too much sugar, you smoke,
yeah,
and you're stressed out, you need to start seriously considering some lifestyle changes because you're now, by my calculations, that's 4.7. Let's say another four, like that's like a 20x increase in your chances of coronary heart disease just by those three factors alone, which likely, I mean, smoking has drastically fallen in the last, even, the last 20 years since I joined the military. Like half the
right.
platoon used to smoke. Now to find a troop that smokes is super rare. Like it's just not a thing. So that's a good thing. But the other two, like stress and eating too many carbohydrates, very very much prevalent. Like that's something that in the military, anyways. Like our meals are heavily carb based, right? Like it's
Yeah.
just like big big freaking hay boxes full of like carby, starchy food, right? Keep you going in the field. And it just carries over, right? You just keep on eating that way. We get our protein, but it's just interesting, from a soldier's perspective, like, yeah, we don't smoke anymore, but definitely the stress levels and definitely the carbohydrates are something that are prevalent within our community and our diets and typically carry over once we're in the veteran world and like we're out of the military. So very interesting to note on that front. So you mentioned now, bringing the cholesterol levels down because that seems to be like, as a treatment, right? Like you're a physician, you're a doctor, right? Your job is to make sure that your patients survive. Like that's your job. So, like my father, who had a heart attack a few years ago, his cholesterol levels were slightly high, so they put him on diuretics and statin drugs. Now, the statin drugs, I'm not too clear on, but I do know essentially that they bring your cholesterol levels down. So, what's the mechanism behind that? What's the rationale behind that? Is it to do like what we're talking about here, lower LDL cholesterol at all costs, so that you would reduce that 1.4 to 1.6x chance of getting another heart attack? Is that essentially what they're trying to do?
Yeah, so that is exactly the theory behind cholesterol lowering drugs, and statins are have been, the ones that we have been used the longest, although there are some newer cholesterol lowering medications, in the past 5 to 10 years. But if we look at statins specifically, we can see that, statins have been the most widely prescribed class of medications. Again, first in the United States, but now I believe that it's spread worldwide, certainly in most of the industrialized countries. And, during that time, we really haven't seen a meaningful decrease in the incidence of heart disease. So that is one of the sort of macro level, pieces of data that I, now look at and question. Most of the reduction that we have seen in the incidence of heart disease over the past 30 years is directly attributable to the decreased rates of smoking, as you mentioned. So we really haven't seen significant impacts from statins, despite the fact that they have become so ubiquitous. And, it seems like almost everyone goes to the doctor these days, and that's the first thing they're getting is a prescription for a statin medication.
Hmm.
The other thing that I see, as a heart surgeon is that many, and, it's probably close to 50%, it might even be more than 50% of the patients that I end up doing heart surgery on have low cholesterol levels, LDL cholesterol specifically. And, some of those are because they're on medications to lower the cholesterol, like we just talked about. Some of them are just naturally low cholesterol levels, and yet they still end up on my operating table. And that was one of the other, sort of big pieces of information that I really started to think about and question, how couldn't cholesterol be the primary cause of heart disease, as we have been led to believe, when so many patients that end up with heart disease don't have elevated cholesterol levels? And we
Hmm.
can also look at the flip side of that, that we know that there are many people walking around with very high cholesterol levels who never develop heart disease. So, there are many conundrums, I guess, that come up if you really believe that the diet heart hypothesis explains, heart disease. It's tough to start answering, some of these questions And, oftentimes the medical establishment is, just kind of brushes those questions aside and say, well, those are exceptions to the rule, but the vast majority of the time it's cholesterol only that is leading to heart disease. And the only thing we can do to try and lower the risk of heart disease is lower people's cholesterol levels.
Hmm.
But again, I think the results of that are disappointing. Um,
Yeah, you were mentioning like the macro level, right? Like looking at just if you take a step back and you're like 50,000 feet up in the air and you're just to say, okay, what's going on here? If you can correlate the drop in heart disease due to smoking, that is like a no-brainer, right? Like that's very cause and effect. Stop smoking, you're going to reduce it. Like it's clearly a big risk factor. Cool. Not to mention all the cancer risks and everything like that. Okay, cool. Great campaign. Like obviously that was probably one of the best public health campaigns ever. I guess like the reduction in death I don't know what the numbers are, but like very well done because I know very few people that smoke now. So that's awesome. But now on this front, it seems like we're stuck. And you say like, well, if this were the case, you would see another, I guess, almost 2x reduction because of the ubiquitousness of the prescription of the statin drugs, but we're not seeing it. And to compare that to the other, topic that we discussed last podcast was just the explosion of obesity and metabolic disease. And we're still using the same hypothesis that, yeah, you got to move more and eat less and keep the same, I guess, food pyramid structure in place. That's not working either because you can just observe like, well, look around, like everybody's obese. I think it's what the majority of North Americans are obese now. I think is it over the 60% threshold now, or at least overweight, at least overweight. I don't know
yeah,
about obese.
yeah.
So then, what from your perspective, you had that shift, right? You're seeing data, you're looking at the macro, you're like, wait, hold on a sec. Like, how do you guys just accept this? And everybody is supposed to be accepting of the scientific method because you're doctors, right? Like you see evidence and you can make a decision based on the evidence. But I think we kind of touched on this last time. What do you think is I guess the inertia behind just a widespread acceptance that, well, we've been doing this what, like you said, since Eisenhower. Why haven't we come around to a more holistic approach where that one pill may help you acutely bring it down, but ultimately, what are your lifestyle habits? Why are you not, having a healthier diet? Why are you not being coached to do different things so that you can actually have a much greater impact on your chances of coronary heart disease by, exercising a little more, not eating as much carbohydrates, maybe going outside in the sun, maybe lifting some weights, adding some muscle mass to your body. What do you think is the impediment to that?
Well, I think it's just that we've gotten so far down this track and we've been so bought into this narrative for such a long time now that it's hard for the system, for the high level, uh, uh, to start to change. Because realize it was a direct relationship. We went from the diet heart hypothesis sort of being accepted, which means that you need to lower the amount of fat that you were eating, which means that you need to substitute, processed carbohydrates for that dietary fat, essentially. And, that leads to the food pyramid, and that, leads to where we are today, that, a high percentage of our diet are processed foods because we are trying to substitute for the whole real foods that we used to eat, that now we can't consume because all of a sudden, despite the fact that we evolved as humans eating these foods, we now think that they are dangerous for us and harming us based on, again, this one diet heart hypothesis, this one theory that saturated fat is contributing to poor health. And we built the whole system around it now. When you look at the past 40 years, the majority of the food that we consume is, in line with the U.S. dietary guidelines, and it's become all this processed food. And you go to the supermarket these days, and 80 to 90% of the food that's in there is, again, processed food. The pharmaceutical industry, which then has, an overly uh, a large effect on the healthcare industry as a whole. Again, has built this whole narrative and is centered on this whole narrative that we need to be using, pharmaceutical agents to lower our cholesterol. And it's just that the whole system, kind of feeds into each other.
Mhm.
And it's hard to start reversing that on the systemic level. So what I now challenge people to do is, to think about it as the individual level and look around you and, realize the results that the system is getting. Like you said, 70% of, adults are overweight or obese. 88% of adults are not metabolically healthy. Heart disease remains the number one killer by a wide margin.
Right.
And so, do you individually, want those results, or do you want to do something different? And if you want to do something different, start seeking out different information, find the physicians that also are questioning this narrative to start working with on that, and figure out, what is best for your health. And you at some point you really have to start basically ignoring what the mainstream advice is if you want to get different results than the results that are all around you.
That's ultimately it, right? That's the hardest thing for a lot of people to accept is like, wait, you mean the government and my doctor don't have all the answers? Because we, for all intents and purposes, like we've gotten this far because we have a great public health system. We had a lot of the answers. We got to where we are now because of it. Like my parents' generation, right? They had no reason to question things. Everything went really, really, really well. But now we're at the era where everybody has their information at the fingertips. You can question these theories that were just, held at, the ivory tower for so long. But now we're realizing they're not really working. But to question things is scary, right? Because it means that you have to accept that you don't know things, or that you have to change your paradigm to accept something brand new. And that requires, creative destruction and then rebirth, which for some people is excruciating. And it's hard for everybody,
Yep.
but it's a journey, right? And I find, and this is just my observation, that in the States, well, obviously there's more of you, so obviously there's going to be a bias to having more doctors like yourself that are pushing against the mainstream and coming out and saying like, well, hold on a sec, like there's I think there's another thing going on here than here in Canada, because it's just likely that we just don't have as many. Like I know one that I follow on socials, and then there's Dr. Fung here as well,
Yep.
Dr. Jason Fung, who's got an amazing book. But there's only two that I really know here in Canada, and I guess I don't know if it has to do with our good naturedness, that pushing against the trend is not really in our nature. But to find a doctor that would be in that realm where they're looking at things a little bit differently, likely is probably not going to be the easiest thing here in Canada, anyways, from my perspective. But definitely in the States, it's something. So for like our Canadian listeners, you have a book that's out. What are some of the main highlights? Like the main thing I'm thinking about is like you've got a list of its lies, right? That you go through. What are some of the highlights there that are pretty topical that somebody could kind of get a sneak peek of your book on?
Yeah, so the book is Stay Off My Operating Table, and the first section of it, goes through some of these myths that we have been led to believe, and both, physicians and, the general public, I guess you could say, have been led to believe that, some of these myths are true. And, one of the first ones I put in there is that, exactly this, that the food pyramid, that the U.S. dietary guidelines are, the best way to eat, the best, thing for our health. And then, the next section of the book really focuses on, what is metabolic health, how to measure it, because, I do believe that metabolic health should be our primary focus. And if we refocus our whole sort of healthcare picture on measuring metabolic health adequately and then helping people to improve it, that would seriously change, a lot of the paradigms that we follow. And that then leads into, what can you do to improve your metabolic health? and I outline, 7 key principles of metabolic health. And first and foremost is eat whole, real food. Because, whether you're vegan or carnivore, keto, paleo, all of these things in between, what it really comes down to is the more that you eat whole, real food, the things that grow in the ground and the things that eat the things that grow in the ground, the healthier you're going to be. And that, of course,
Right.
means eliminating processed food with the processed carbohydrates and the fake vegetable and seed oils that are, that have led us to the point where, 88% of us are not healthy.
That's so crazy. And folks, if you're curious, I can't remember the number of the episode that was, but it's a simple one to find. It's, will you pass the 88% test for a metabolic threshold test that Dr. Ovadia set out with the 4 criteria. And what were those 4 criteria for metabolic health again?
So actually, 5
Oh, it's
criteria.
five. Good.
Yep. The first one is your waist circumference. So again, just take a tape measure just above the level of your belly button. If you're a man, you want that to be less than 40 inches. If you're a woman, you want it to be less than 35 inches. The second one is your blood pressure. And to be considered metabolically healthy, your blood pressure needs to be less than 130 over 85 without the use of blood pressure lowering medications. Then you look at your fasting blood glucose level. You want it to be less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. This is the US units, again, without the use of glucose lowering medications. And finally, we do look at that cholesterol panel, but we don't look at the LDL, the bad cholesterol that you and your doctors have been so focused on. You look at 2 other numbers on there: the HDL, the so-called good cholesterol. The higher, the better for this. Specifically, if you're a man, you want it to be over 40 milligrams per deciliter. If you're a woman, you want it to be over 50 milligrams per deciliter. And finally, you look at the triglyceride level, and you want that to be less than 150 milligrams per deciliter.
Okay.
And that's all in the book. And I also have a tool set up at my website at ifixhearts.co, and it just marches you through those criteria so you can figure out where you stand on your metabolic health.
Very cool. Now, I guess one last thing, like if I'm going to see my doctor soon, in the next month, because I turned 40, so I'm like, I guess I should go see him. Right? Like, so good. Everybody's like, I gotta go see him. You gotta go see him. You're 40 now. You're not like a young kid anymore. I'm like, all right, cool. I'll go see my doctor. Now, I know that we're going to do blood tests, and when they do the blood panel, when they do cholesterol, should I be asking for a specific set of cholesterol tests that are outside of the norm, or should I just go with the LDL, HDL, and triglycerides, and then be able to, like with your recommendation here, be able to look at it myself and be able to read and be like, oh, okay, well, if my HDL is above 40 milligrams, it's milligrams, right, not nanograms per deciliter, and my
Correct.
triglycerides are under 150 milligrams per deciliter, I'm good. Like if my LDL is like, and he's like, oh, your LDL is way too high, I could be like, yeah, but I'm pretty sure I'm fine. Is there any other tests that I should be looking at when I do
Yeah,
that?
so it is sort of a, we don't have the definitive data about the situation that many people, who have improved their metabolic health may find themselves in, where they are metabolically healthy. They have a high HDL cholesterol level, they have a low triglyceride level, they have a low insulin level, which is another blood test that I recommend everyone get checked. Their blood sugar levels are low. All of their measures of metabolic health are good, but their LDL cholesterol level is what is considered high, and it's an ongoing question that people are investigating whether or not that is a situation that you should be concerned. Typically, what I recommend to people in those situations is that they do more advanced testing. So, we now have much better tests than LDL cholesterol to measure heart risk. Specifically, we have what's called an NMR panel, where we actually can look at the different sizes of all your cholesterol particles. We can look at the number of cholesterol particles, which also plays a role in calculating your risk. But we know that basically, you know, essentially there are two types of LDL cholesterol. There are what we call atherogenic particles, which are small, dense particles that tend to, kind of clump up and cluster together. And then there are large, fluffy, cholesterol particles that you can, don't stick together. And so using that NMR panel, you can figure out, how much of each you have. And if you have more of the large, fluffy particles, you are less likely to end up developing plaques and heart disease. We have a couple of other specialized tests that you can talk to your doctor about. There's one called ApoB. There's one called LP little a, lipoprotein little a. So the bottom line, is that there are much better tests than just the LDL cholesterol level. And I think one of the biggest, tragedies of our focus on LDL cholesterol is that most doctors don't know to look beyond that. And most doctors don't realize that, LDL cholesterol is still a big sort of class of, particles, and there are lots of little subparticles within there. And when you start to look at the little subparticles, you can get much better information about whether or not, you are at risk of heart disease.
That's extremely valuable. And yeah, absolutely. So you could essentially and you mentioned it earlier, right? Take control of your own health. Like it's your health. Like your doctor is doing what you're asking him to do. And they obviously have the medical expertise to be like, well, my recommendation is you do X, Y, Z. But if you go with your knowledge of what we're just going over here, like that's huge. You could just be like, okay, my LDL is high. Can we do the following? You could do like an ApoB and like look at my NMR test.
Yeah.
And likely the doctor will say, "Oh, okay, this guy's bringing his A game. All right, sure, we can order those tests up." Like, my doctor's great with that. Like, I can order tests up, and he goes, "Yeah, you sure you want to do that?" Mm-hmm, yeah, absolutely. Because I typically last time I went, I want to know like my testosterone levels. I'm a trainer. I want to make sure that I'm in the right range. I talk about it all the time. I want to make sure I'm good to go. So on this case here, I'm definitely going to bring that information when I go see him. And if my LDL is high, I'll just say, well, can we do, or even while they're doing the test, I presume you can do it. You don't have to have a high LDL. You just say, hey, I want the following test done as well, so that I get my entire blood panel and it's a truer picture of what we're looking at. But I guess before we just kind of wrap up here, like when we're taking a blood panel, it's a snapshot in time, right? It's not, there's nothing longitudinal. So let's say I don't know, is it possible that my cholesterol's out of whack that day, but let's say hypothetically, it's actually kind of normal the rest of the time? So is it possible that individuals are just getting like labeled with like high cholesterol that don't actually have high cholesterol, or is cholesterol just basically pretty constant, throughout your time span?
Yeah, it does vary. Unfortunately, we don't have. This sort of goes back to the fasting blood glucose level versus wearing a continuous glucose monitor and seeing what your levels do throughout the day. We don't really have continuous blood lipid monitors. Although it's an interesting concept, we just sort of assume that your levels are going to stay the same. But we know that there are lots of things that change your cholesterol levels acutely. You look at people who are in the hospital sick with infections, and that's going to increase your cholesterol, your cholesterol level, because it turns out that cholesterol plays a role in the immune system.
Oh, cool.
Or when you get very sick, your cholesterol levels may drop because your body's like, okay, we got to focus on other things than making, cholesterol and sex hormones right now. So there are lots of things that can affect it. And so it does become problematic that we just look at, tests in one snapshot in time.
Right.
And that leads me to another recommendation that I oftentimes make to people, is that rather than trying to figure out, and sort of read the tea leaves based on these blood levels, which may be problematic, we do have a good test that can show you whether or not you have disease in the arteries of your heart. and it's called a coronary artery calcium scan, a CAC scan. It's a type of CAT scan. It's a quick test. It literally takes about 5 minutes to do. They don't have to put an IV. It doesn't involve giving you any IV dye or IV contrast. It can be done pretty inexpensively. Here in the United States, you can oftentimes find it for $100 to $150. And that will actually show you whether or not you have evidence of disease in the arteries of your heart. So I think that is a very underutilized test, and it's another test that I use frequently with my patients and people who are in this situation again where some numbers look like you're at high risk of heart disease and some numbers look like you're not at high risk of heart disease. The CAC scan can be a very useful test to actually show you whether or not you have evidence of heart disease.
Brilliant. A CAC scan. Okay, I just took that down and note because I'll ask for that as well. I mean, if I'm going to go to the doctor, I'm going to do the whole kit and caboodle. So I'll definitely put that on his radar as well as the NMR and ApoB test to do the whole battery while I'm there. That's great. That's huge. That's a ton of value for everybody that's listening right now. Just that alone, right? To be able to kind of mitigate, I guess, any potential issues in the future. You can have an inexpensive scan. Like that's news to me. It's probably news to everybody else too that you can ask for this scan. So that's huge. And so just to summarize, cholesterol isn't the demon that we've been making it out to be. And ultimately, it's much more nuanced than what we were led to believe. And what are some, I guess, final thoughts on your end for the listener that may be concerned that, hey, my cholesterol might be going up. I might be getting older in age, and I want to make sure that my heart can last well into my 70s 80s, see my grandkids, could see my great grandkids, and actually have a healthy and life and thrive into my old age and not have to worry about coronary heart disease taking me out.
Yeah, so I think, again, this comes back to focusing on your metabolic health and ensuring that you are metabolically healthy. And, not only does that end up lowering your risk of developing heart disease, but also many of the other chronic diseases that plague our society today. So when we look at many forms of cancer related to poor metabolic health, Alzheimer's disease related to poor metabolic health, and you can just keep going down the list of, the things that end up killing us. And most of them, it turns out, are related to poor metabolic health. So first and foremost, I encourage people to focus on their metabolic health, understand what it is, know how to measure it, and, work with your physician or, other health practitioners to be improving your metabolic health. And that is what ultimately is going to give you the best chance of living a long and healthy life.
Awesome. And that's hard work too. You got to struggle at it. It's not like taking a pill, but
Yep,
the
that's
benefits are significantly greater. That's awesome. So how does somebody that either wants to get your book or get in touch with you and work with you, because you're in the States right now, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so again, the book is called "Stay Off My Operating Table." It's widely available at all the usual major online places. My website, ovadiahearthealth.com, OVADIA hearthealth.com, has all the information about connecting with me, working with me as a patient, and lots of great resources to help you learn about and improve your metabolic health.
Awesome. Been an awesome third episode. Definitely provide a ton of value here for the listeners and for the hard to kill community for sure. Definitely going to be up there with the last episode on metabolic health. So, folks, get out there, start working on your metabolic health. Stop smoking, stop eating all the carbs, start working on getting some muscle mass on you, and we can start improving those hearts and making sure that you last long into your 70s, 80s, and 90s. So, Doc, really appreciate you coming on. And folks, don't forget, train hard, fight easy. See you next time. Peace.